So, I'm Steve Dudley. I've been asked to talk about my three great-grandfather, William Edwin Weld, who was a resident of Guilford in the mid to late 1800s. As you can see, he was a carpenter, a builder, and he was a prominent citizen, born in 1815 and died in 1902. Now, that would make you imply that he spent all his life in Guilford, but he was removed to Long Island for a while. I got to give credit where credit's due. None of this is my original work. It's everything that was done by previous parts of my family, and it has to do with a couple of things. Number one, we're a family that never threw much away. And so a lot of stuff remained. It was mostly the hard work of my grandfather, Shelton Weld Dudley. Now, that's kind of a strange name, but you'll find out sooner or later that his name actually was three surnames from the family: Shelton, the Welds that we're talking about, and the Dudley that married in. And for those of you who are not aware, John Plant has been working with the plate negatives that and old ones. These are ones that my grandfather accumulated and rescued from basements, from attics, from barns, and cleaned them all up so that they were usable to save the photography work of a whole pile of people, Houston, and others that were involved with it. And most of the pictures you'll see tonight involve further work by my father, who was not well liked by my grandfather because he didn't pay a lot of attention to history until after my grandfather died. And then he got into it, but unfortunately at the time of his untimely death, he was just getting started. And the other thing I have to rely on is the genealogy work that my mother did. We had all the genealogy for most of the family, but she took and entered that database with over 2,400 people and all the data that went along with them into that. And without that, I can tell you, I'd be lost. So, and the other thing I've got is a whole pile of anecdotal information. My grandfather and I used to take the trash to the transfer station on Saturday, and then we'd go out for a ride around town, and he'd tell me stories, and we'd go look at varying parts of it. And sitting on the back porch with my great-grandfather, you heard a lot of stuff too. So a lot of this stuff, I hope is true. It's stuff that was family lore. So if it's wrong, I'm sure I'll be told. Okay, just to go, Willie Weld was my third great-grandfather. For those of you who remember the Thomas Griswold house, that was my sixth great-grandfather. Governor William Leet was my ninth great-grandfather. And that's all the families that are really the older ones. John J. Walker is my second great-grandfather, and he came to work to the States to work in Beatty Quarry and laid out work for breakwaters, bridges, and the base of the Statue of Liberty, which was where Beatty Quarry granite was utilized. Frederick Theron Dudley, the picture you see on the sheet, is my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather was born in the old stone house while my great-great-grandparents were caretakers there. And Amelia Bradley was his mother was the first curator of the stone house. Now, there's a little story that goes along with that, and you wonder why things happen the way they do, but the Dudleys decided somewheres in 1884 that they were going to move to Colorado. So they went lock, stock, and barrel, including my great-great-grandmother's piano, by train out to Colorado. They spent 4 years there, decided they wanted to come back to Guilford. Their feet were stuck in the mud like mine are in the Guilford soil, and they came back, and she went back to work, and they went back to the stone house. So there's a lot of things that would have happened differently if they'd stayed there, and the whole situation would have been a lot different. Okay, William Edwin Weld. He's a descendant of the Welds that arrived from England in 1632 in the Boston area. The family ultimately migrated from Boston to Roxbury, down into Longmeadow, Massachusetts, Durham, and then to Guilford. He had to start supporting, he had three brothers and a sister. He had to start supporting himself at age 10 by working on a farm where he got board and clothing. Now, that just goes to show me that the family didn't have a whole heck of a lot. So therefore, they had to farm the oldest boy out in order to do that. At age 15, the decision was made to move the whole family to Sag Harbor, New York. I guess what happened at that point in time is Sag Harbor was an up and coming community. There was a lot of work there, so they moved there, and he started the trade of carpenter and joiner along with his father. Somewhere in that vicinity, he went to sea, because that seemed to be what most people did in the 1830s, is they went on a whaling vessel out to sea. So he went out to sea along with his 5-year younger brother, Fred, and they went out on whaling vessels that went into the South Atlantic and looking for sperm oil and whalebone. And after a few trips, he decided he didn't like that. So he, 1 year short of becoming captain, went back to carpentry work and ultimately returned to Guilford. He started a construction lumber business. He married Myrta Holcomb, picture that you have there, in 1838. My family had pictures of everybody in great number, and so therefore I've got that luxury. And then he built and moved into 45 Boston Street, somewheres, I think, around 1849, though that's an unclear date. I'm sure Joel would correct me, but that's what we've got. And you've got a partial list of his structures, a whole pile of structures on Boston Street, some on Fair Street, some on Little Meadow Road, some in Madison, some in Brantford. Willie Weld was a very busy individual. So what I'm going to do now is go through some of the structures that you will recognize. And I'll start off by saying these are pictures my father took in 85 and 86 before he died in 87. So if the cars look a little ancient in it, you'll have to understand. Oh, he also did renovations in numerous properties, including the First Church, the Old Stone House, Christ Church, the Simeon B. Chittenden home, the big yellow house at the intersection of Broad and River. And he did miscellaneous carpentry work, including coffin making and the removal of the fence around the green. So he was sort of all over doing everything at that point in time. 45 Boston Street, where my grandparents lived and ended up having that property coming down through the family, was William E. Weld, built it in 1849. And my father's records show that it cost him $1,292. But the thing that I think you'll find that's a Willie Weld hallmark is the attic windows. If you look at them, you've got the front and back attic windows, and they're a fairly unique design, and he was very, very careful to do that in most of the houses that he was involved with. And just to give you an idea what life was like in the 1840s, according to this, the property was total of about an acre by the time it was acquired. The first quarter acre was acquired from his cousins, Sarah and Beulah Weld, and you'll see the purchase price was $77.14, paid over time. $20 cash, a barrel of flour, 1 load of wood with carting, some more cash paid by the wife, and then the last piece of cash to total it. And so some 8 months later, or 9 months later, it was finally paid off. The other 2 pieces were acquired subsequent to that in 1844 and 1846. You have 39 Boston Street. This was built by Weld for Benjamin Bradley in 1860. It was there was a house that sat on that site, and that was torn down, and this one was built adjacent to the original site. This was purchased by my great-grandmother, Lillian Jenny Shelton Dudley, at the time of her marriage in 1894. So Willie Weld had done fairly well in managing her assets, so she could afford to purchase the house next door from where they were living at 45 at that point in time. So again, you go on and you start looking at what he built. He built the building at 11 Boston Street. For those of you that are old enough, it was once called Collins's Restaurant, had rooms upstairs, and it's now part of Page Hardware. He built the Page Hardware building. He built 44 Boston Street, across the street from my grandparents' and great-grandparents' house. And the interesting thing about this is that in the back buildings, this was the home of the Crampton and Weld Fire Engine Company. So Willie Weld was also involved in the construction of early fire engines within to try and start helping for fire control in the borough of Guilford at that point in time. The next one you have is 65 Boston Street, which is the one that was built for his brother, Captain Fred Weld. Captain Fred Weld was William's younger brother, and he went out, when they moved to Long Island, he also was a farmer till he became 12, and then he became an apprentice to a watchmaker in Sag Harbor, New York. And then at 15, he got wanderlust and was a cabin boy out on a ship. He then graduated over the years to captain and was a captain of a whaling ship for until 1868. You'll notice, though, that the house was built in 1851. We have some letters in the family that came from Fred to his brother William, talking about how he didn't think he was going to go back out to sea, and so therefore he wanted to have this house built. So they moved back, he and his wife, from Sag Harbor to Guilford and had this house built. But of course, the call of the sea came back to him for two reasons, as best as I can determine. One, he liked being captain, but two, it was good pay. And so therefore he went back to sea and went to a number of different areas. He sailed the Atlantic, the Pacific. He was as far out as Hawaii, then known as the Sandwich Islands. And he was up in the Arctic Ocean also. Got frozen in one winter. He talked about staying with the Eskimos up there. So the guy got around. The interesting part of it is that in 1856, he was in the Pacific, got into a heck of a hurricane, and managed to just barely, they were lost for a month and a half, overdue, coming into Hawaii. And they finally got there, and the boat was in such poor shape. They'd lost the mast, they'd lost sails, they'd put stuff back together again and got it there, and the boat was condemned and sold off. It was in such poor shape at that point in time. Further out Boston Street, next to the Highland House, you've got 88 Boston Street that he built. You've got 264, which is Mabel Rolfe's, was, for those of you who are old enough to remember, when she was living there. And then you go to Fair Street, and you go in a complete and different change of architecture. And you see these two houses that he built on Fair Street in 1850 and one in 1862. You see in a lot of the pictures that my father did that he had a number of different styles of architecture, but he loved the Federalist style. But as you can see, these are entirely different to go along with it. So he managed to keep very busy. You have also on Fair Street a more traditional of what his style was that he was involved with, and this was the home that he built for his father-in-law, me Dad Holcomb. And then you have the one on 22 South Fair Street. This was originally built, as with a lot of houses in Guilford, and faced onto Water Street because South Fair didn't exist at the time this was built. Sometime after that, it was moved over onto South Fair Street when South Fair was cut in and a new highway was built in the borough. And then you have another one on Whitfield Street, another one on Whitfield Street, and you can see that he varied his style around depending upon what his clients wanted to go along with it. You have, then he went over and did some in East Guilford. For those of you who might think that it's now known Madison, I've been corrected by the board saying that shall always be called East Guilford if you're talking about the Keeping Society. And this one bears a striking resemblance to a number of other ones that he did in Madison, and also 205 Clabbert Hill Road, the former house of Edith Nettleton at the top of Clabbert Hill at the corner of Tanner Marsh Road. Put two pictures of the two of these side by each. The natives on Clabbert Hill say that he didn't build it, but I don't know. If he did, somebody was copying somebody else because it's just about exactly the same. Then you have some other of the other ones that he built, different ones. 39 North Street was built as the Tommy Smith Hotel. And you'll notice that some of the dollar amounts vary all over everywhere. I can only assume, based on my father's compilation from Weld's journals, that this had to do with how much work Weld did versus the homeowner or property owner concluding them out as they went along. Because you've got the hotel at 748 and a house up on Little Meadow Road, not far from the southernmost entrance of Meadow Ridge for only $138. Then you have the next version of my great-grandparents' house at 39 Boston Street that was built at 33 Whitfield Street, now St. George's Rectory. A big house, a lot of money for those days, 3,800, almost 3,900 bucks. You had the other one on George Well on Church Street. And then you have the rear picture of Christ Episcopal Church. William Weld was a member of Christ Episcopal Church. He was a member of their vestry. And in 1880s, he was engaged to expand the vestry. At that point in time, he was getting towards the end of his career, but he was still active and he went to work on it. And the work was done and the vestry was expanded. The interesting thing about that is being having come along from where he did and being aware of the value of everything, he kept what glass that was painted glass, what people would normally call stained glass, but it was really painted. Whatever he took out of the back of there that was no longer needed, he hauled over to his house on Boston Street and put it in the attic. It then got hauled next door to my grandparents' house at 39 Boston Street, put in the attic. And when we sold that, my father hauled it home to my mother's house on Tanner Marsh Road and put it in the attic. So it was one of those things where when I cleaned out my mother's house last year, it was, what am I going to do with this glass? And the logical thing was to give it back to Christ Episcopal Church. So I took it down to the rector there last fall, and that was returned. But that gave you an idea of how his upbringing brought him to understand the value of everything that he would be taking out to go along with it. Willie Weld was also the contractor for all of the woodwork, quote unquote, that was in the Institute building. The Institute building was built in the 1850s. The first class went into it in the fall of 1855, and it was the result of a gift from Sarah Griffin, originally $10,000, increased to the amount of $11,200, and a gift from Simeon B. Chittenden, who owned the house at the corner of River and Broad, and the big yellow one, and he donated $10,000 to that, and it became the high school for the town of Guilford, and for both men, for boys and girls. This was one where they were very specific that they wanted it to educate the youth. You had to pay tuition for it, but the basic property and the improvements were done by those people. And Willie Weld and the family ended up with plans of it and this architectural rendering, which is one that we found in the attic at 39 Boston Street, hauled it out, flattened it out, and had it mounted so that we have this one that predates, that obviously was what was done prior to the construction that went on to accomplish the Institute. And just as an aside, I, along with Keith Bishop, am one of the few remaining trustees of the Guilford Institute, because when the high school, which is now Adams School, was dedicated in the mid-30s, the Institute ceased to be of function as a high school for the town of Guilford. And then the question became what to do with it. And the trustees wanted to sell the property, went through a court case. Superior Court then decreed that the trustees would continue to exist, the structure could be sold, and any proceeds and endowment that remained would be under the discretion and jurisdiction of the trustees, and they were to invest it to get the highest possible yield, the yield of which would then be paid to the high school for the advancement of any students and plant that might be necessary in the high school's interest. So that still exists today. Those funds now rest with the Guilford Foundation. The Old Stone House in 1868. And again, this is a photograph that hangs in my basement because it was another one that we had somewhere around the house, and I decided it was nice enough to have around. In 1868, at that point in time, it was owned privately. It was before the state accomplished it. And a decision was made to do some renovations. And this is how it looked the year before the renovation started in 1869, which William Weld did. Some significant alterations as to go along with that. And the irony of it is that while he didn't know it at the time, he was working in the house that was occupied by his future grandson-in-law, the Dudleys, who were occupying it then. And my great-grandfather was born at the stone house 3 years later in 1872. And just to give you an idea of what the times were like at that point in time, some of the information that came out of these diaries and information that my grandfather had assembled showed how some of the apprenticeships happened. And they happened if sometimes they were 17, sometimes 16, and they were usually until such time as the young man reached age 21. And you can see when he started out, he wasn't paying much, $15 a year. And then if the guy worked out, it'd be 20 for the second, 25 for the third, the second one. But the interesting thing is that obviously as Weld became more prosperous and learned more as he got older, you look at the last one, he was being paid after the war, $50 for the first year up to $110 for the fourth. But the interesting thing about it is that he then had part of it. He was in agreement that if William E. Weld should find it is of no advantage for him to continue this agreement, he has the liberty to consider it at any time null and void. So he made his agreement, but he had his escape clause that went along with it. Willie Weld, as I said before, was one of the early organizers of the Guilford Volunteer Fire Company, and he helped build early horse-drawn fire engines. You know, you wonder where things go throughout the years, but then you come down to my grandfather, Shelton Weld Dudley, who worked at Norton's Garage at the corner of Graves Avenue and Boston Street, and helped build the first 3 or 4 of Guilford's motor-driven fire trucks. And they were based in Norton's Garage, and Norton's Garage had a siren on the top of it so that there could be a call for volunteers. So, you wonder how families tend to get drawn towards the same thing. He was a vestryman for Christ Episcopal Church, and he was a burgess of the borough. Now, for those of you who don't know what the borough was the southern part of Guilford, bounded on the east by East Creek, the one you go over just on Boston Street just before you get to Soundview. And that ran all the way up to crossing Nut Plains Road, just a little bit east towards Nut Plains from the intersection of State Street. It went across just above that intersection of State and Nut Plains, across over to roughly where the Catholic Cemetery is at the moment, to the West River, and then down and around Long Island Sound, and back to where it meets the East River and East Creek again. That was the borough. The borough was an area that had more improvements and had some other taxes on it to help with those improvements, as opposed to the wilds of places like where the other part of my family lived, Clabbert Hill, or even further wild out in North Guilford. So they had a board of burgesses that controlled that and ran that until such time as somewheres in the 30s, when the borough ceased to have as much usefulness and merged itself into the town. Willie Weld was also first selectman when the town hall was built. He used his construction expertise and helped write the construction specifications, and he was first selectman at that point in time. So he was there taking care of that and making sure that the construction went along with it. Now, another piece of family lore that I'm not sure whether it's true or not is that Willie Weld also, when he was selectman, that was about the time that the railroad, or right after the railroad, was double tracking through Guilford back all the way to New Haven, because the single track started in the 1840s, and then they double tracked later on in the later 1800s. At that point in time, the family lore goes, again, not sure whether it's true or not, that there was a drawbridge on the railroad over the West River. And at that point in time, the railroads wanted to have a fixed bridge so that they didn't have to worry about that when they double tracked. So supposedly the town was compensated for the lack of access or a drawbridge for north of the railroad tracks. And supposedly, according to family lore, that money came into the town and the town used some of that for the building of the town hall. That's one of those things that some one of these days I'll have to check and see if I can find out whether it's true or not, but that's sort of where it's at. With regard to family, he had 3 children, Jane Clarissa, William E. Jr., and Julia Augusta, who only lived a few months in 1860. Jane Clarissa married Charles Shelton. They had a daughter, Lillian, who was my great-grandmother. Charles Shelton died at a very early age, and Willie Weld then took and was the manager of his granddaughter's estate proceeds. So he was a shrewd guy. He managed it very well, and he was comfortable enough so that when she purchased 39 Boston Street, at the time she was married, they put another addition on the back of it for what she wanted, and they had servants for a little while because she had the resources in order to support that. And for what I only knew her till I was 4 or 5, but the whole family lore is that she was, shall we say, a demanding and feisty lady. Let's put it that way. Okay, now the other thing is that Joel will appreciate this, but if you see that you've seen these probably in the Guilford Library, that's the 1852 map of Guilford published by Clark of Philadelphia. This is an oilcloth map that shows the entire town on the right-hand side and the borough limits on the left-hand side. And if I go to the next slide, you'll see that it had all of the houses that are around the green and what the owners were as close as they could be determined at 1852 when this map was prepared. And so you'll see, if you could see down on the bottom half, a little bit east on Boston Street, you can see William Weld, you can see Whedon, which is the current house that Anna Dwyer owns, and then F.A. Weld, which is the one that I showed you before. But the novel thing about this is you can take a look and you can see graphically the misalignment of Boston Street, Water Street, State Street, and Park Street. And all of those, for those of you who don't remember, is because in order to get blacksmiths, a couple of times the selectmen sold off part of the green on the east side and sold off part of the green on the south side in order to get to the point where they had the people that they thought were necessary for the community to thrive. And this graphic, I think, shows what it would have looked like had they not done that. So I think that is enough for me for the moment, but I would be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have along.
But I do want to compliment you, Stephen, on your engaging presentation. Deb Palouse and myself on the library committee back in the 70s and 80s certainly had the joy of working with your grandfather, Dudley. And, you know, we stopped by at 45 Boston Street, and your grandmother would give us chocolate chip cookies, and we gabbed about Guilford history and talked about the glass negatives. Certainly your grandfather was the consummate historian in his own right. And then that baton was passed on to your dad, as you mentioned, who shared the same enthusiasm. And now you, Stephen, may I say, in the 5th generation from William Weld, your driving passion and your participation now on the GKS board is a joy and an inspiration to all of us. So we thank you for tonight. Very engaging. And we're very proud of William Weld.
I might respond that what you have seen tonight is just a little bit. I have 20 some odd tubs of my grandfather's material, which is up in our daughter's basement in Farmington, awaiting me sorting it after I retire. So I got a long way to go.
Well, GKS could someday hopefully be a repository for those. We are indeed keepers of Guilford's heritage, and perhaps that day will come. Under Chairman Plant, we have a library committee ready to go.
Stephen, the range of architecture is stunning. And do you have any concept of where and how Willie Weld got his training and how he, achieved this vast array?
As best as I can determine, and Joel will probably correct me that I'm wrong, but according to information that I have, he was a disciple of Asher Benjamin, who was an architect in the area, and he liked the Federalist that went along, design style that went along with that. He, I would guess, built a lot of things for a lot of people based on what was popular at the time. Of the dozens and dozens of houses that he built, I'm sure that he was more interested in managing to keep that captive individual than he was imposing a style on anybody. So you'll see as you look at the pictures, they're all over the lot, from very simple to the very ornate, such as 39 Boston Street and 33 Whitfield Street and the ones on Fair Street.
And some of them, if anybody here has the chance to go through the basement of Town Hall, or some of the rooms in it, you'll see it's built like a fortress, as is the Guilford Institute. These are not just houses. They're huge departures from residences. And he did all of it. It's astounding to me.
Well, you talk about the Town Hall, and you, as the Keeping Society, are the repository of all the notes and stuff that came out of the Town Hall when the renovation removed the coal bins that were down there. The Keeping Society ended up with all of those notes, bushels and bushels and bushels of them. And David Dudley at that point in time brought them over to my grandfather, and he spent a whole pile of time doing the rough inventory for the first cut through that, unfolding all of those notes and being in a position where he could then do a rough category and brushing the dust off them to go along with it. I know John has spent a lot of time on that since then, but that first go round of dust removal and opening them up was attributed to my grandfather Shelton.
Incredible stuff. Incredible stuff.
The other thing is that before I finish one more time, is that somewhere I've got to start and do, because he did a history of the Guilford Volunteer Fire Department and fires in varying houses and all of those type of things. And one of the things that I really do hope to do is put that in a position so that it can be shared in some fashion, whether it's published or whether it becomes out. But he spent an awful lot of time researching what house was where they responded to. And I don't think anybody else had that level of concern or detail, and it would be a shame not for that to be shared with the community.
Keith, did you have a question?
Yeah, Stephen Skeep. Did you come across very much for architectural drawings of what he based the house design upon, and who actually made the plans, or did he actually do plans for a substantial number of those buildings themselves and the engineering aspect?
As best as I can determine, he did a lot of the drawings himself to go along with that. Whether he had help or not is a question that we just don't know. I have found, and Joel will probably want to add to this, but I have found a couple of notations in his books that my grandfather had transcribed, and there is some on a couple of drawings, which all the drawings that I've got went to the Keeping Society, and Joel recently managed to find some more that had somehow escaped the family and convinced a benefactor to buy those, and they're now back at the Keeping Society. The only connection that we have found on any of those is there are a couple of them that are noted, and there's an indication that he paid architect Henry Austin of New Haven for some assistance. So there is a connection there. The question we don't know is how much or who did what.
Mm-hmm.
But again, Austin's the same one that designed the Congregational Church.
Yeah, I'll comment on that, Steve, if I could. We're very grateful for your donation of so many of those drawings, and certainly The cream of the crop is the Guilford Institute watercoloring that you showed us tonight. But we had a couple, George and Susan Morris, Morriss, who are unit owners in the Guilford Institute. Now, of course, it's a condominium. And they donated a fair dollar amount, I believe it was $1,000 in the last month, to purchase 11 drawings that are companion to the drawings that you have donated. And these were found in New Haven in an antique shop. And as you state, somehow they escaped from the family at some date unknown. And we're very happy that all these drawings could come back to the archives room in the Medad Tavern. But I often wondered, and this is a question for you, Stephen, as the rising historian in the shoes of your dad and grandfather, did William Weld create his own drawings? I've always suspected he did.
I think he probably did on a number of them. And I don't know what the training was that got him to that point, but given that he built as many houses as he did, I can only suspect that he was doing that himself.
Certainly, William Weld was, we say, the leading builder, master builder, man for all seasons in Guilford during the whole antebellum period. And I think your presentation tonight showed that it's simply awesome to realize that he started building houses in Guilford, I think 1839, right up until the 1880s, just a few years before his death. Just a remarkable record.
And you get the pieces in the family, like we have all of the letters that Fred Weld wrote to William Weld when he was on the sea, or copies of them that went to the gentleman that owned the boat. And you get that information. You get the fact that William was involved in politics, being on the Burgesses and then as first selectman. Of course, the novel thing about that is one of the things in his notes is he was very proud when he first was able to vote for Andrew Jackson as a Democrat, and he remained a Democrat. His brother Fred was a Republican and shied out of politics and out of any involvement. But you also had Fred Weld when he came back from sailing in the late 1860s, who then went to work with his brother as a carpenter. So, you have all of these interconnections that are out there that we only know a bit about because my family didn't throw anything away.
Steve, I'll add one more thing about Frederick Weld, who was, of course, your great-grandfather 5 times brother. Was that 65 Boston Street, I believe, was the Frederick Weld house?
It's what was the Hanrahan house right up opposite John Dillon's? Yeah.
Opposite John Dillon's. There was an estate sale there last year, I believe it was, when Mrs. Wharton Hubbard moved out of there, and the antique dealer, or the one consigned to selling everything in the house, found the original bill of sale for that house by Frederick Weld. And I was away on vacation, but John Dillon, Attorney Dillon, arranged to purchase that bill of sale. It's not too unlike many of the bills of sale that you have, and not too unlike the construction ledgers that you have. And that was acquired for the Guilford Keeping Society. So imagine, the bill of sale had been in that house for 170 some years.
Yep. That's what happened in the family houses. When we cleaned out my grandfather's house at the top of Clabbert Hill, the next generation after Thomas Griswold, the John Griswold house up there, there was stuff that had been in there since it was built. Every generation just kept living in there and not throwing anything out.
Well, you have your own archives. Maybe it ought to stay that way.
Joel, there isn't going to be anybody after me that's going to want all that stuff. And I'm not sure I've got room for all of that stuff, but we're working on it.
Yeah. Okay. I got a question.
Sure.
I just wondered, Steve, if he had employees, and he couldn't have done everything, including plastering and so forth. And he had to sub out some of the millwork, and there's got to be some record of that somehow.
Yeah, again, from my grandfather's information, for what I pulled out of a couple of the tubs in my daughter's basement this past Sunday. I got some of the apprentice information and a couple other things for people who are doing bills and things like that. But I didn't get that deep a dive into the dozens and dozens of scrapbooks that my grandfather had about that. I just haven't got that deep into it. And again, the problem is that I've been too busy trying to raise a family and make a living over the past 30 some odd years to be really diving into the stuff that was just sitting there waiting to be looked at.
I can relate. But I will, you mentioned the name Asher Benjamin, and I know that Charles Bullfish was another architect of that time period, the federal time period. In fact, they did the church up in North Guilford, which was a platelet booklet that was offered at the time. You could plate number 36, and they would pick from them, and you'd have the print. You know, it's interesting.
Done very shortly.
Oh, okay.
Again, I'm assuming that actually happened because of so many of the Federalist ones that look exactly the same. You know, my father went around in 85 and 86 and took pictures of attic windows all over everywhere in Guilford, in Madison, in Clinton, in Killingworth, in Brantford, to try and get some flavor as to what the style was per town and who was building what. That's another whole bit of information that I've got to sift through and see if I can make any logical sense out of it. But again, I'm not going to live long enough to take and solve all of these mysteries. I can just see what I can do at the moment.
Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I enjoyed it.
Stephen Vandermellen, you mentioned Asher Benjamin, as did our speaker tonight. Steve, I think when you dig through the archives, if my memory serves me correct, your great-grandfather 5 times, William Weld, owned a copy of the Companion Builder's Guide by Asher Benjamin.
Yes.
I remember seeing it, and I remember particularly some of the descriptive details in that book. Design plans match exactly the mantle surrounds in his house at 45 Boston Street. So that will be a prize when you find it.
It's probably there somewhere.
This area, you got to tell me again. You've told me this is the second time I've heard this, and I still don't quite get it. The Willie was the burgess of this borough of Guilford, and the function of the borough was to do what? Economic development in a central
It's my
area?
understanding that the borough had more improvements and a slightly higher tax than the rest of the town. And Joel's going to correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure about at this point in time. But it basically was the more densely populated portion of the town. And that's my understanding, is it was a little more organized than the rest of the area that was out there. Joel, am I correct on that?
That sounds right. I would compare it to the Sachem's Head Association, a government within a government with its own taxing authority, created by an active legislature. And so regulation and promotion of improvements, I think, was #1 on their list. And
Which
I think
also, didn't Joel that also be part of the Guilford Water Company that started part of that too?
sounds right. They were responsible for the lamp posts around the village green, digging wells on the green, quite frankly, establishing the first fire department as well.
I think Sachem's Head was established mainly to get a water line in.
Right. You've got other family artifacts. As I sit here, I think about it. The fence that was taken down around the green in the 1880s, and some of the lumber that was taken out of the stone house when it was renovated in the late 1860s, Willie Weld kept, and he made chairs out of them. And, we still have a couple of those chairs. I'm not sure whether they came from the wood around the green or they came from the stone house, because my Aunt Mildred, my grandfather's unmarried sister, had notes on everything. She listened to her mother and her grandparents, and she wrote in ink on little pieces of paper and affixed them to china, to pictures, to furniture, so that you knew where that stuff came from. Some of it was complete time spent dwelling in minutia, but some of it was very interesting. You know, the picture you saw of Murda Weld and of Willie Weld in the presentation were ones that have Mildred's Murda Weld, wife of William E. Weld. Some of them have dates on it. You know, the picture that I had of the schoolhouse was one that somebody paid for to have made, was mounted in a very ornate wood frame, but Mildred had written on the back of it, Old Stone House, 1868. So, you know, I have that luxury also.
I just want to say before we finished that because you gave us so many wonderful things as Pat Lovelace, museum director, we are going to have our exhibit next summer. Hopefully, pray God that we are open. And it will be on William Weld and all that he did and all the buildings that he worked on. So thank you so much, Stephen, for donating all that stuff to us, and to the Morrises for buying the other pictures, the other drawings for us. Thank you.
Yeah, for example, Pat, you have a very decent picture, a big, good-sized picture of Willie Weld.
Wonderful, yes.
You also have a rafter that came out of a house in Madison, and I've got to look up on my father's stuff as to where it came from, but it was painted on it, William E. Weld, as something that he left as a trademark in the house that he built, and when it was renovated, it was cut out, and my father, in contacting them, ended up with that. So, you know, you've now got that also along with it to show stuff that happened and how he made sure that people knew it was his house.
And we also have his woodworking box with all of his tools and stuff in it, thanks to you. Thank you.
Such as what's left of it, yeah. But, yeah.
Marvelous.
Stephen, just to piggyback on Dana, it was an absolutely wonderful performance, and thank you so much for sharing with us.
Well, it made me dig in the tubs and try and get some of the stuff out so I didn't look too stupid here tonight. So I appreciate your comments.
Great. Thank you so much. And on that note, I'll just add my thanks, Stephen, and appreciation. We're so pleased that you've done the job that you have over the years. I mean, this isn't, you know, this isn't just something you've just started up. And I know how much work has gone into it. And you've been very generous to us. And we look forward to the relationship going forward. So with that, I wish you and your family a very happy Thanksgiving. Thank you again for tonight's presentation. And to everybody who's been here this evening, thank you so much. Be happy, be well, be healthy, and tell your friends to join the Keeping Society, and we'll see. The best is yet to come.